This is Conservation and Science podcast, where we take a deep dive into topics of ecology, conservation, and human-wildlife interactions. And this is the recap of all the episodes from 2024. Enjoy!
Quite a big number of wolves will be culled this year. But this is where the agreement comes together. Of course, the nature conservationists and the wolf lover in me I'm not happy about the wolves that are hunted, but I see that this is the price. Everybody must get something. Otherwise, poaching goes underground, and people will be very hateful, and you have to give everybody something, because the hatred really is born in the moment you lose your sheep or animals. And you don't know if you're going to get the compensation. And if it's like Estonia, then you get it in 1 year. Let's say you lose your sheep in January, so the payment is next January. And if you are Latvian, then you get nothing. They have no compensation. So, we see that there also the hatred is building up. And of course, sometimes you get the compensation, very generous compensation, but still you have hatred because it's rooted deep. 3 layers deep, because you don't want to deal with it. And why it's so deep? It's because the benefits of having an apex predator, we all have it, but the cost goes on very little group of people. So they feel they pay for our wolf love, and that's true. So you can't really achieve what you want to achieve, namely that everybody respects the wolf. No, they will hate the wolf in their heart. And if you don't allow to hunt the wolf, then it goes into poaching, and then you lose maybe the whole pack. But if you give out some of the permissions to hunt some of the wolves, then you perhaps keep the pack but lose some of the wolves.
There is some really, really interesting stuff happening in Sweden at the minute, where they've got the dogs to tell them what odor the dog is actually tracking. So they're doing lynx, wolf, and bear, and whenever the dog is on the track, the dog they make the dog wait and get the dog to show them which odor they're actually tracking at that time. They say what predator is in the area type thing. So it is possible for the dog to specifically tell you, oh, down that burrow is puffin, down this burrow is mag shearwater. But we haven't done it, but here it sounds like it might be a good crack. So maybe in the future.
And how the dog indicates? Like 1 bark, 2 barks? Like how is it?
No, so we train a passive indication. So for my dogs, I like a sit down and stare. So for example, at the burrows, they will sit and stare down the burrow. And then for the pointer, she literally points at whatever it is that she's found. So she just does a freeze, and the nose is pointing at the odor, which will be good for the curlew nest. As soon as she hits the odor of curlew nest, I don't want her to move. So that she is a statue as soon as she comes across it.
So it's type of like dog sits, dog lies down, or whatever, and that way it can tell like, wow, this is really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Could you give so other questions, like you mentioned that people in Sweden doing something like that, is using dogs for conservation like a discipline, let's say, that is growing in the conservation world? Or is it like super niche, or is it popular? Like where is it?
It's definitely growing. So some countries, it's like mainstream. They've been using dogs almost for centuries. Like New Zealand, for example, they were using dogs in like 1890 to like find kiwi. Like this is not a new thing for them at all. In America, they've been using dogs for a long time. Even in the UK, we were using dogs to help count grouse, setting and pointing dogs for a long time. It's just that they weren't, we didn't really class them as conservation detection dogs who weren't trained in that kind of detection element. But in the past 10 years, I think it has grown massively here. And it is continuing to grow. And the number of projects now that are coming to us and asking, is a dog useful, has grown absolutely massively. Yeah.
And the title of the paper is Anthropogenic Food Subsidies Hinder the Ecological Role of Wolves. Insights from Conservation of Apex Predators in Human-Modified Landscapes. And essentially what that paper describes is that the region of Italy called Abruzzo, more than half of diet of wolves is livestock, arguably fallen livestock, not like depredation. But the point is that if we think we bringing back wolves for them to keep the wild ungulates herd healthy and regulate the numbers, then this is their intended ecological functions. And if they have these anthropogenic food subsidies, then obviously they're not fulfilling that function. So that is another very important consideration before answering a question whether I'm for reintroductions or against reintroductions. Clearly, restoration would be a better term. Some prefer the term re-establishment. I read a book by great conservationist Roy Dennis, who was part of an incredible number of reintroductions, and he described them all in the book. And the title of that book is Restoring the Wild. You see what I mean? It's not reintroducing the wild, it's restoring the wild. But, well, the reintroductions is a term that is most often used, so I guess we stuck with it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Predation is often underestimated in terms of impact on a lot of, in particular, ground nesting birds. And I think that the point is that with increasing agricultural intensification, for example, on grasslands, the haymaking has largely been replaced by silage. So the nutrient cycling is much faster. There is more food, there is more earthworms, there is more rodents. Think about the vole densities in grasslands. So there is simply a much bigger carrying capacity for these small predators than what used to be the case historically. And all these foxes and stoats and weasels, and they spread through the countryside. And it's just the sheer number of predators that seems to be, in some cases at least, the main driver for declines. And if I might give a few examples, the black-tailed godwit, despite all the conservation efforts, you see that predation is still one of the main causes of decline. Grouse species have disappeared over large parts of Europe. The curlew in Ireland, it's probably also predation related.
Some countries might have bigger areas that are either suitable or should be protected, and therefore they have, larger burden, which to me, like, even, considering nature restoration or protection in a category of burden, is like, oh man, that's not good. But that is the real problem, right? Like how you gonna share this burden here, I say.
Yeah, which makes me think maybe we should replace the word burden by something more positive. You're right.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
I'll take that idea.
Okay, thank you. I'll take a credit. If it's changed, I'll take a credit.
I think you deserve it.
All the definitions really mean the same thing. And that's, I like to pare it down to giving nature the space and the time, crucially, to dictate its own ecological trajectories. And that means ecological succession without us interfering too much. And yes, there is this problem of a definition, a globally unifying, generally accepted definition. And, that's why Ian Conbury at University of Cumbria and myself and, a group of our colleagues were asked by the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, to try to bottom this out and come up with a unifying definition, which, is exactly what we've done. We started work in 2017, big survey of people we identified through a sort of snowballing exercise as being key informants, early adopters, innovators in the field, and then subsequent surveys of rewilding organizations. to identify a set of guiding principles and definition, and that's what we've done, So yeah, we're hoping that's useful, and it is being picked up by various organizations and individuals as being, as near as damn it, a formal definition.
I think that the part of that was like you said that even hunting can mean different things to different people.
Absolutely.
But then the term is around for so long that most people intuitively know what that is, while rewilding is fairly new, right? It's like when it was first, like in the 80s, I think that was
people started talking about it in the 80s. It first appeared in print in 1990 in Newsweek magazine, an article by Jennifer Foote. And since then, it's been a term. It first started being used mainly in the USA and North America, USA, Canada. It's crossed the Atlantic. It's become something different on this side of the Atlantic, I would say.
How different? What was the difference? I'm curious. This is very interesting because that never come up, right? Because originally it was like a wilderness recovery.
Exactly.
Which my head is way less contentious, if you like, than rewilding. And then, so what was the change when it crossed the Atlantic?
I think, in North America, the impetus was really about connecting up remaining wilderness areas.
In my mid-20s, I got connected with Tom Brown, the tracker, out in his work, and I got to spend time with him in some classes. And he's one of the living treasures that we still have as far as a direct connection to the Lippet Apache Band of the Southwest of the United States, and their traditional techniques and tactics and lifestyle. So not only is he a tracker and a survivalist and able to, teach people these things, but he also talked about their philosophy and spiritual habits and the importance of meditation. And so from there, that's what triggered me into being interested in structuring some meditation into my life and my lifestyle.
And I just wanted one thing that I want to say for people who are listening to this, that meditation is not, there's a lot of people who will say like, oh, some woo-woo meditation, what are you doing? And there is a lot of like a huge body of peer-reviewed neuroscience about the benefits of meditation. There are very serious studies done at Princeton, at Berkeley, at all the top universities, who are it's just undeniably pointing to benefits of meditation, various types of meditations for your mental health, for the focus, for how your hormonal system works, how your endocrine system works.
And I've been on a lot of grouse moors and non-grouse moors. If you want to see almost like a zoo of wildlife, go to a good managed grouse moor. You will not only see the grouse, but you will see songbirds. You will see all these non-game birds, and you'll see all these red-listed waders, oyster catchers, curlews, all that stuff in large numbers there. And it makes sense because the habitat's been manipulated or enhanced in order to, in a way that propagates their ability to survive on the land. And they're not stupid. If you got a little quarter or half acre section that's been burned and you got new growth coming up there from the heather, all of a sudden you're in a scenario where there's food for them and there's an open area there where they can kind of keep an eye out for predators. But predators, guess what? Wherever you have lots of game animals or lots of food, in this case, walking McDonald's all over the place, you're going to have lots of predators. In this case, the avian predators, which are protected by law, just like here in the United States. You've got the golden eagles and kites and buzzards. And you go out on a grouse moor and you might see half a dozen different species of avian raptors, and you're going to see them in pretty good numbers. Whereas if you go to other places that don't have that type of management on the land, yeah, you might see some here and there, but it's the difference between going to a proverbial zoo and just being out someplace next to town somewhere in a cow field, which The other thing is a lot of people talk about biodiversity and this whole concept of biodiversity loss, and that there's a crisis going on in the highlands because these grouse moors are diverse, don't have the diversity that some people think they should have. You go up to one of those, go up there with a gamekeeper and a good ecologist, a good scientist or biologist with a pair of binoculars, and they will show you things that you never see, because I don't think humans take the time to really sit there and watch this stuff. And there's a great number of animals, like I said, up in that area. And that area has evolved to be like that. It's not a product. On the outside, it looks like we've kind of packaged it by human hands, by the muir burn, which is the low intensity burning in small areas. And so you get this patchwork mosaic of different growth. And it's to me, when I first saw it, I was like, wow, this is kind of cool looking. Of course, in August, when the heather all turns and blooms purple and you get all this stuff out there, I mean, the place is absolutely off the hook gorgeous. But this land has evolved over thousands and thousands of years. So again, using science as our main common denominator, if we go back 9,000 years ago, Scotland in the Highlands was covered under glacial ice. There wasn't any trees, there wasn't any heather, there wasn't any deer, there wasn't any humans.
When the season started, I was at the sea every weekend, and that lasted for 3 or 4 years. As soon as the season started, late July, early August, running till the late October, early November, as soon as the reports showed up that the sharks are around, hell, some of those reports were from the boats I was on. I was out. I was doing it. And every shark that we caught was measured at full length to the tip of the tail, fork length to the fork of the tail, and girth. These measurements were meant to facilitate establishing the weight of a shark, because you cannot weigh a shark on the boat that is rocking. And the sharks were tagged with a tag number and released. And this tagging program is run by Fishery Board in Ireland, and it's called Chart. We have a podcast about this program, and this is gold standard program for tagging sharks and rays, elasmobranch species. Okay, the data is available to scientists. A lot of research was done based on that data. Great program. I would never claim shark conservation. I would never say that I'm a shark conservationist or that I'm doing shark conservation work. I just didn't. I was just doing whatever I was doing. I was shark fishing. You see the similarities? No shark was better off by being caught, handled, and tagged. Similarly, like no bird is better off by being caught, handled, and ringed.
Maybe the thing over here is that we don't have that much we are not opposite sides in Finland. We have a common, of course, we have different angles to things, and of course we have different perspective to bird questions. But for example, in waterfalling, we have a perfect similar way that we can work together for the waterfall. And since Finland is an important area for bird production, it is vital that in a small country with many lakes, we combine our effort and work for the waterfall.
And what comes to the Sotka project itself, we are only a small part of a much larger project, and of course there are parts in the bigger project. There are some for the wildlife agency and parks and forests working on the state-owned land, and so there's a little piece for everyone working in the sector. And also we were honored that we were given this small project of ours to run. And since we're talking about voluntary things to work with, I suppose it was very natural only to ask for the for the kind of third sector associations to do that work?
During the study, they had our colleagues in this project, some of the co-authors, had GPS collars fit to lions in this property. So this is at Old Pejeta Conservancy in Kenya. And I think we had 6 collared animals, each in a different pride. So that's about 66 lions. And you can tell when lions are either very inactive or if they've killed something based on the pattern in those GPS locations and how they show up on your computer. So then people would go out and investigate what we call a GPS cluster, a cluster of points from the GPS collar, and see what the lion was doing in that area. And that's where we discovered what they were feeding on and the type of habitat that they're feeding on in the study. So we noticed that, yeah, they definitely like to kill zebra. That's their preferred prey. So about 60% of the things lions kill in the system were zebra, and most zebra were killed by lions. That's how you die if you're a zebra, 90% of the time. So we got a sense of what lions were eating and then where. So whenever they made a kill site, we measured visibility in that area, and we discovered that, yeah, which is pretty common knowledge, that lions use cover to conceal themselves as they attack and kill prey.
Like most cats, right? They're ambush predators.
Absolutely. Yeah. So then we have this observation that lions like cover to kill things, but cover is declining. So what does that mean? And that's where this long-term data come in. And we've noticed that over time, the proportion of zebra in the lion's diet has been declining, and it's being made up by Cape buffalo, which is a huge animal to attack, right? These are big, scary beasts. And yeah, so lions have made a switch, and there's some reason for that. And we don't see a relationship between cover or visibility and buffalo kills. So whatever makes a buffalo vulnerable to being killed by a lion doesn't depend on woody cover in the same way that it does for a zebra.
I think the cap is not fit for purpose.
Especially now.
Especially now, and especially with all the talk of all the future accessions into the EU. Like even Ukraine alone would mean an entire rewrite of the cap. It would be completely unsustainable to just like have them in and continue as it was. So I suppose what I would really like to push for would be a common food policy. I was interested to read there the IFA were saying, I can't remember the exact wording, but it was basically that the cap should be for agricultural production and not any sort of social intervention and stuff. And I'm like, what do you think agricultural production is? Like, that's a social intervention. It's food for people. And what I would like to see, I think agricultural production, first of all, has become so much more efficient than when the cap started. Like you can produce vast quantities of grain with not that much labor. Like obviously things like vegetables and fruits are different. But in terms of calories produced, we can now more than ever produce more calories per human worker than we ever could at any time in history. And I don't think that a policy that is solely built around increasing agricultural production is sufficient in this day and age. I think anything around the environmental impacts, because these aren't separate. Like that's often things like, oh, the environment is separate to agriculture. It's the same thing, but they're always just tweaks, and they famously have not had that much success over the last few decades in terms of birds, in terms of insects, in terms of soil, water quality. Famously, the CAP environmental projects, we're still going the wrong way in a lot of ways. And so I would like to see a kind of policy brought in as well so a food policy. And I was, myself and another girl from Mayo were part of a group that kind of went and workshopped this proposal, it must be 7 years ago now, for a common food policy for the EU, which would basically incorporate all of these things, incorporate not just the agricultural production section of it, but all the way to that getting onto people's plates.
What we need to do, particularly in the more populated parts of the world, is very much a landscape approach, a negotiated approach, where you look at You don't say we're going to rewild the whole of Wales, which isn't going to happen. You really negotiate how and where and when. There's very good reasons for doing that. There's good reasons, not just biodiversity, ecosystem services, things are not. But if you go in with too heavier hand, it probably won't work. And we're sort of seeing this with the EU restoration law at the moment, where there's been such huge kickback for farmers. There's lots of reasons for that, and it's not just about restoration, but if you go in too heavily, it won't work. So really need long-term negotiation. And in terms of bigger things like tigers and human-wildlife conflict, there's a lot we can do. There's a lot we can do in terms of reducing risk and so on. Modern communication systems, modern ways of fencing, modern ways of alerting people, but you're right. It is going to be a human cost. We spent quite a lot of my partner Sue has spent a lot of the last 10 years working on tiger conservation, on improving management standards for tiger reserves around the world. And tiger numbers are going up, but more people will be killed. And in the countries where tigers exist, there's often a fair amount of philosophical acceptance of that. But there's going to be a limit of that as well.
That must be, on occasions, I presume, weighing heavily on people doing that conservation, where it occurs like, my work, it will be direct or semi-direct reason some people will get killed.
Yeah. But it's true of lots of things. It's true of if you build a road. It's true if you build we don't tend not to think about that.
Generally, the way I explain it to students is, an invasive species is a species, plant or animal, microbe, whatever, that's come from one biogeographical realm to another, generally through human transport. Let's take something like the Chinese mitten crab from China, is now in UK, it's now in Ireland, it's in Europe. So it's come from a very different biogeographical area with different environment, different evolutionary pressures, different other species around it. And quite often those species then have impact in the new locations, such as predation, competition, disease transmission. And because they're very new to the area in an evolutionary sense, they can bring novel weapons, such as illegal chemicals in plants, like Himalayan balsam, for example. They can be, the native species can be naive to the introduced species, so don't recognize them as competitors and predators. And therefore, there can be a distinct ecological and environmental impact. The EU tends to think of invasive alien species as encompassing all of that. Transport, coming from a different place, becoming established and having impact. We tend to separate out the two elements of invasiveness being the ability to arrive and become established in a new location, such as many species travel on boats across the Atlantic, end up in North American Great Lakes and establish and colonize, but not all have impact. Impact can be something that is almost neutral or indeed positive. Many species actually add to our environments and our islands and continental areas, but many have distinct impacts, such as zebra mussel, such as peacock bass, such as crayfish species that are moved around. So and invasiveness and impact aren't necessarily correlated. So you can be very invasive without impact. You can be very few individuals but have huge impact. The story I told this morning to my students was in 1894, a lighthouse was built on a small island called St. Stephen's near New Zealand. And the lighthouse keeper brought a cat to the island, and the cat killed the entire population and every last individual of a species of wren that lived on the island.
Another big one that showed up in the responses is talking about poachers and how you distinguish hunters and poachers. And you might think that this is very easy, but it is not easy. Some would say that, okay, who is a poacher? Poacher is an unethical person who kills wildlife illegally, right? And often poachers and hunters are purposefully kind of conflated. You sometimes see the article that says like illegal hunters or illegal hunting. Well, illegal hunting is poaching by definition. However, it is never that simple. For example, in South America, there are a lot of tribes who are traditionally hunting animals for subsistence or otherwise. And then government decides that now hunting a specific species is illegal because the species is endangered, threatened, or something along these lines. Except that nobody bothered inform those people. Nobody bothered even send someone to their village deep into the forest to tell them that now they can't hunt these animals. Just inform them. Never mind to get their opinion or get them on board or get them to try to understand. So they wake up in the morning and they do what they always do. Except now they're poachers. Therefore, they're making immoral decisions. Like they're not making any decisions. And whether they are poachers or not, it depends on which angle you're going to look at it. And even in England, I think, or in Great Britain, term poacher were like, Robin Hood, or people who were exercising their rights to game animals, to wildlife that were taken away from them by, kings and dukes and, all these.
The loss of dung beetles trying to feed on manure, which is from an animal which has been wormed, it's a problem. And you could throw in pets as well in there. So, when it comes to the changes, yes, agriculture has played a massive part, and the loss of hedgerows, increasing field size, the demand for lower cost food, economics. But I'll throw an interesting example in on this one. I'm born and raised in Suffolk, so East Anglia, the prairies of Eastern England. And, I walked to school when I was 3, 4, 5 years old. So, I can remember what the hedgerows were like, what the verges were like, the flowers. We were taught to go out there and identify them and recognize them. And looking through the next 50 years and thinking, well, yes, fields have got bigger, but a great deal of that was post-1940. We have more monocultures. We have more use of pesticides. We probably have less use of pesticides now than we used to. But one thing that's disappeared is the mixed farming systems. We used to run probably 400 beef cattle. All of the farms my grandfather had about 7 different farming units, were surrounded by meadows, and none of these were reseeded. All of them had incredible biodiversity. And what's gone is these islands of biodiversity and the grazing animals that went with it. And I think large parts of the world, we've lost the grazing animals from the landscapes. And I look at Suffolk now and think, crikey, the only meadows I can think of have got horses. Horses are almost certainly regularly wormed, which is not helping. So we've actually progressed from expanding the monoculture of arable and oilseed rape, and we've then systematically removed all of the islands, and the ones that are left are pony paddocks.
Field and Stream, the American journal, from I think 1894 or something, and they really in detail describe how there are so many dead ducks in this pond in the US that you could fill barrels of them, and exactly how they have died and how that is explained as being poisoned from feeding, so just ingesting lead shot that they would then take instead of grit from the bottom to have in their gizzard. So that's a second one, the primary poisoning of ducks mainly. And then the fourth one would be secondary poisoning of predators and scavengers. So this is not them actively feeding on the bullets or shot, which is what the ducks do, but scavengers and predators accidentally basically feeding on this. So say you shoot a ptarmigan without killing it, then you could have a Guy Fawkes taking it It's of course easy to take a ptarmigan that has been shot at and maybe crippled slightly, but it flew off, but it's still not flying well. The Guy Falcon will of course be more likely to take that as compared to a completely unimpeded ptarmigan. And you could also have effects from leaving gut piles. There are many cases where this has been studied and showing elevated lead levels in everything from cougars, pumas, to ravens, to white-tailed eagles, things like that. And the more of a scavenger a species is, like the white-tailed eagle, the more of a problem there might be. So in Sweden and in Finland, we're talking something like 50 to 20% of the sea eagles that die have such an elevated lead level that they died from it, or would have died from it unless they flew into a power line or something. And that's something they are more likely to do when they are affected by the lead. The white-tailed eagle is doing fine from a population perspective, but the individuals are, of course, suffering while dying from this. So it's still an ethical problem, I would argue.
Not that productive. I'd love to put in a pond there that cost me, a few €1,000 to do a cheap job. You'd be talking about spending more if you wanted to fence it properly away and maybe plant a few trees, do a bit of landscaping around it, and have it a nice amenity feature on the farm as well as just a biodiversity feature. Maybe we don't need that. Maybe we just put in dig a hole and let it fill with water, which it will in that area. But there's a cost involved in that. Am I supposed to do that? It does no monetary gain for me from a farming point of view, or does the likes of the government help with supports to do that if we want biodiversity gain on the farmland and in the countryside? So I can't see how people that want to improve biodiversity and want to improve nature, they don't seem to want to engage with farmers. And we need to improve on that in the IFA as well. And we're very well aware of that now, that as we move towards nature restoration, as there's a biodiversity climate fund, we need to engage properly with that process and with the nature restoration process to make sure that we look for the right things and we try and get the right things and we try and get the right supports in place to make those happen, but alongside productive farming rather than instead of productive farming. And some of the messages coming from nature restoration law in the beginning would have said that there will be no more roads built in certain areas, no more houses built in certain areas. And if you have a farm family, there might be a son going to farm, there might be a daughter going to farm, there might be another sibling that wants to build a house on the farm to feel an attachment to the area. It could be at the edge of a village, but they have ground and they have a site, and they might have, my sister has a house on the farm, my brother's up the road from the farm. And we were hearing that that was going to be outlawed, that there wasn't going to be any more development in certain areas. So obviously alarm bells go off. You're talking about re-wetting ground, re-wetting farmland, as well as government ground or board and mono ground or semi-state ground. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. There was a lot of people given a false story of what was going to happen. There was no economic impact assessment done on it for rural Ireland or for farmers. There was no budget in place for it to make it happen. So farmers get very nervous then, because there has been other schemes that haven't worked out for farmers financially, where ground has been made less productive in some areas. I think you have to apply to the government to reseed the ground, and it could take 2 years to get a reply from them. Obviously they just don't want you doing it, so they'll just put your file to the back. And if you want to make, I think there was 30 different measures, that if you wanted to do any of those measures on your block of ground in areas of conservation, that you'd have to apply to be allowed to do any of those measures, where I can go out and reseed a field here now. So the control of the ground and the rights and the property rights of the farmer are taken away in certain circumstances. And we'd like farmers, within reason, within planning guidelines, and to be able to decide what they want to do with their own ground, rather than having everything dictated to them from Europe or from government.
Being a little bit of a devil's advocate, as this question: are humans natural? Are humans part of nature?
We couldn't be more part of nature if we wanted. We are part of nature. Nature's part of us. But for quite literally thousands of years, and there's been writers that go back beyond Aristotle who talk about how humans separate themselves from nature. We go to nature. It is outside. It's a view we have. It's like a window or a screen that we look at and we see it's out there. We're inside in our created homes and our created securities behind the force field. But in reality, we are driven by nature. We evolved as a result of nature. It's a process that has given rise to us, and we are very much part of nature. However, one of the biggest problems we have as a creature is we don't know that we are a creature. And it has given rise to so much of the problems, including the type of behavior that we use, that has destroyed a great deal of the parts of our planet and our climate and so on. And it is that disconnect, the removal of ourselves from nature, that we could put our finger on and say, well, if we could at least fix that, if we could reconnect, there is a very, very big chance that we could maybe alter our behavior to be more sustainable. Not all humans are like that. There are quite a lot of humans, for example, from indigenous communities in different parts of the world, up until relatively recently, and in some cases still, that are still quite part of nature. But still, indigenous peoples and ancient peoples also caused a lot of extinctions and problems. Nothing like the global effects that we might have now, with possibly some major extinctions we might, like mammoth and so on. But then we're not 100% sure whether it's climate or it's environment or hunting or so on. So we still, even in our earliest days, in the days we hadn't really developed a society as such, that we currently know, we still had technology, very rudimentary technology. We still had technology that impacted nature. So yes, it is, unfortunately, we do tend to see ourselves as separate, but we are, in fact, we couldn't be more like nature even if we tried.
Emerging evidence of links in early modern literature right through to about 1700, which would add 1,000 years onto their presence in Scotland, which is really interesting. So there's issues that need to be debated and discussed there, for sure. I think what limited ecological evidence we have in Ireland at the moment would suggest, and I'm thinking of Colin Guilfoyle's work, that we just don't have the forest cover and the habitat for lynx, and that probably means for wolves as well. So right now I think it is extremely challenging. But in terms of that crystal ball and the trajectory of the coming decades, is that we're likely to see systematic change in marginal upland areas, where partly for climate change reasons and partly for nature restoration, we will see large-scale reforestation and also renewable energy and recreation outcompeting marginal upland sheep farming. And what that is doing is creating the habitat, and as deer populations expand to fill those forested upland areas, the prey base for both lynx and wolves. So I'm wary of putting a time frame on it, but in 2040, 2050, things may be very different. And add to that is the growing support for rewilding, particularly amongst urban and younger individuals who are going to be the voters and the policymakers in 20 years as well. And the Overton window is what is politically acceptable to a given population at a certain time. And right now, I would suggest in both islands, the Overton window is here, and above the Overton window is lynx reintroductions, and above that is wolf reintroductions. But the Overton window is going to start moving up in those coming decades, and it may so happen that lynx reintroductions fall within that Overton window at the same time as habitat and prey have increased in upland areas. So this is a debate that we'll be having for many years, many decades. And lastly, what that gives us is time to really think through, could this work? How do we manage deterrence and force and enterprise and compensation? How do we solve these issues? What mechanisms do we put in place so that farmers are listened to and their concerns are met, while acknowledging that you can never please everyone all of the time?
The outcome has very negligible risk to people, to animals, and there might be certain risk to the other plants. But with today's methods and know-how and expertise and technology, that risk is really dwindled down to almost zero. That is why we're seeing in many countries in the world full GMO plants being grown. Even Europe is now being more open to that. US, Brazil, Canada, Argentina, wherever, taking full GMO plants and planting them, there's almost very negligible regulatory requirement because they've understood the risk. What you do have is the public perception based upon about 3 decades ago, when this technology was really early on and very in its early stages, and there were risks associated. And it was very hard to have a foolproof product and to follow it. There were certain risks that were associated. There were very small incidents that arose, and they're still with us today. But in modern times, today, from scientific, there's no risk whatsoever. Now, what we do is not considered GMO. We use CRISPR technology. We do gene editing. We are genetically engineering the plants, but GMO means a plant with a foreign genetic material in it. What we do using CRISPR, we silence existing genes. We don't introduce foreign genetic material. So if you look at the plants that we sell and you look for foreign genetic material, whereas with the GMO, you will immediately recognize the GMO plant. With ours, you will not tell apart my plant from a conventional plant.
It's a difficult balance, I would say. Livestock farming in the UK and worldwide is under continuous pressure and sort of ever scrutinized, and is something that we are trying to really champion on the farm. As we can produce really good quality food, but also conserve nature. We can keep these biodiverse grasslands and the flora and fauna and everything else associated with it. We can find that balance. And, the farm was a traditional mixed farm back in the 30s. There was a lot of chemicals used, inorganic nitrogen used. And now we've sort of made this push to really align with Natural England objectives and say, okay, let's think about this. What are we doing? And it's now a lot more nature-friendly farming. It's really orientated around the biodiverse grasslands that we've got and producing what we like to call biodiverse beef from it. So it's been a real challenge, and it's still on an evolving journey. But I relish that challenge, and I'm very excited to see where the farm sort of is heading, and has made some really good big steps already in that hopefully positive direction.
For sure. Paint us a picture. How does a farm look like? What is the biodiversity on a farm?
So it's a 650-acre farm on the southern edge of Salty Plain. So our neighbours are the Ministry of Defence and also Stonehenge. So it's a landscape that's full of culture, really. It's really big rolling hills, big open landscapes, not many trees. We've got small areas of scrub, but predominantly these big wide open areas of chalk grassland. So the total area of the farm is dominated by the SSSI, so Site of Special Scientific Interest, which is Parsonage Down. So it was designated back in 1980 for its biodiversity in its flora. So we've got some very rare plant species like the early gentian. We are home to the burnt tip orchid, which we are one of the largest strongholds in Northwest Europe actually for it. So we've got all this makeup of plant species that only can survive through the grazing using large herbivores, so sheep and cattle. And the landscape typically was grazed by sheep. It was a very sheep-dominated landscape, and those sheep would move on quite regularly, like as they would in the wild, moving on as a rotation. But now the landscape has moved towards cattle. Cattle are more profitable. There's more money in them. So the herd of longhorns has sort of always been there. They've been there since 1939. And we are very privileged to manage the oldest herd of longhorns that's still registering females every year. So there's a lot of history of the landscape, but a lot of history about the farm and the herd. So the longhorns have always worked on the landscape, and we sort of treat it as one big area.
So we're missing out on a lot of information. And so it's external, we don't put a weight on the splashiness of a research finding. We want people to be able to publish all of their results, including negative results or pilot studies, because that is all really important. And when we think about, when you're doing research, you're trying something new, right? And oftentimes it doesn't work out, or you're inventing a new method or something like that. And that finding might not fit into like a traditional journal format, and might not be worth the thousands and thousands of dollars to publish. And so at Sachs Journal, we're really trying to decrease these barriers for sharing all of these important findings. And it's like, that's one angle of it. Another reason why so much of this research is not getting published is because, the processes of peer review haven't been designed to keep up with the pace of science. And so, I mentioned earlier, it can take years to publish an article. And so if you have a small finding, it might not be worth it to go through that process, that burdensome process. And, I started Sachs Journal a few years ago because I had one of these experiences. I had just wrapped up some research on, the effects of wildfires on carnivores in the Pacific Northwest. And I really worked hard to get that research out to the people who would be making those land management decisions. And it took almost 2 years to get that research published. And, during that process, there were lots of important decisions that were actually being made without that research, without that up-to-date information. And by the time it was published, some people thought it was actually outdated. And so I thought it was just an issue in ecology, right? Like, that is my background. I'm an ecologist by training. I've been doing ecology research for, 15 years. And I started talking to other researchers, and I heard that this was just a pervasive problem, that people's research was not getting published. It was not making it out there. And, I've been in the science world for a while, and I know that scientists are smart. We're really capable. We're really talented. And it's like, there has to be a better way. And so through that research process, we developed this new model of peer review that can be efficient and streamlined and also very trustworthy.
I think these are good people who are doing it out of despair and a sense of what will wake people up, what will make a difference, what will change the action. Extinction Rebellion never set out to be disruptive or violent. Factions of it had got a different view. I was at the big London event when the tube strike and when people were complaining about it. So I can understand that. You always get a more radical faction, but most people that I meet on marches are peaceful, loving, caring people who are at their wits' end as to what will wake people up and what will make a difference. And I can understand, wouldn't do it myself, but I can understand. I mean, you've got little old ladies who look like Quakers, going into museums and tapping things. They're my favourite too, actually. They would not do that unless they genuinely believe the world is in true peril.
And what were your feelings when you heard about the lengthy prison sentences for the activists? And
I'm horrified. I'm really horrified. I think the fact that we're criminalising in the UK, in England in particular, peaceful protest, that the government has made it almost impossible to give civil disobedience in a manner that is respected and kind of responded to. We've gone to a place that is criminalising, I think, good people who have an important message.
Do you think that the US through their military personnel or some other ways are pressurizing NGOs who are fighting against the resumption of whaling? Because surely they not stoked having those organizations around, right? Because those NGOs then are going head on against the national interests. And that's a serious stuff.
Oh, yeah. And in fact, I know someone who's been going to IWC meetings for decades. And she told me when she started going, some guy from the State Department came up and was prodding her in the chest saying, "You don't get it, girlie. This is about national security."
Whoa!
Yeah. It's a bit like another thing I've got in Common Dreams is a piece about elephants. Because, there was that belief that, ivory was the white gold of jihad. And it turned out it wasn't true at all. but it got the US military and security community interested in this stuff. And then they just engage. And I found that was really interesting because, I used to work at NOAA, and at the time we had, when I was there at one point, we had someone from the State Department who happened to be around. They're talking about some stuff, and they're talking about how when at the time it was Secretary of State Clinton came back from a meeting and said, "What's this about Ivory being involved in, supporting terrorism?" And apparently she went to the national security community and they were just like, we don't know. Because the bottom line is that, if it's not geopolitical, these folks aren't interested. I mean, animals don't matter to them. It's these interactions among countries that matter to them. And they're like, don't ask us, go ask the NGO community. So there's always been this pushback. And we've seen that play out in a bunch of ways over whaling.
It's just the way the media use the word almost as a tactic to create a reaction that they want. Often people use it. I see it on the news a lot. The word is used, and see it on all these different TV programs, hear it on the radio, and you can tell they don't really understand, the context they're using the word in. So they just use it to label everything. It's a difficult one. It's a new word. I say in the introduction to the book, if there's 14 of us that write in the book, if you put us all in a room together and wouldn't let us out until we came up with an agreed definition, we'd still be there, because it is one of those words that's very hard to define. I say that we're singing from the same hymn sheet, but we're kind of singing different words, perhaps, even though we're all in harmony together and in our general feeling. It's there is an official definition of rewilding, which I find quite interesting, quite ironic, because at the end of the day, rewilding is about humans stepping back and letting nature take control, and yet we still want to keep it within the strict parameters of what that word means. I don't think there's one overall misconception that's problematic, because everybody in the book writes about their own specific misconception or myth or misunderstanding. So I don't know. For me, I guess it's that feeling that humans still have to be in control and decide the outcomes of what they're doing. And we have a very, very strong need to always be in control, no matter what it is. And you do see some great examples of supposed rewilding projects where they actually want the outcome to look like this, rather than allowing nature to decide, not decide, just to let it happen. There's still, actually, we wanted our woodland to have bluebells and oak trees, and they try and control it. And that isn't really what rewilding should be about. It should be about giving natural processes the rein to do what they do.
As I've said, where my strongest expertise is on agriculture, and maybe I can take that as an example, because I think that this is where obviously we do see. It's a sector, an activity that does impact a lot on our natural resources, our environment in general, and biodiversity in particular. Why is it so difficult? We have been farming and let's say consuming also agriculture products in a certain way for decades. And while it is clear from science that if we continue as we do, we won't be able to stay within planetary boundaries, and eventually we will hit the wall. To put it bluntly and simply, and it's not just something that will have impact people outside of the sector, but the sector itself, farming will be among the first victims. We see that already with climate change and the loss of pollinators, etc. So why, despite not just the knowledge, but what is happening in front of our very eyes, things are not changing? And why? Because we do have policies in place, and I think this is also important to stress. There are several environmental policies that have been adopted, in the past decades, that are out there on water, the Water Directive, on biodiversity, Birds and Habitats Directive. And the problem does not lie with the policies themselves. It lies with the implementation and the fact that member states are not implementing them as they should. So why are we there? The problem is it's systemic. This is why it's so difficult to tackle it. and I take the example of agriculture because it is quite obvious. We're not going to manage to change our agricultural practices if we are not changing the food system as a whole.